The 2022 F1 season is a development race. The new regulations mean that there are potential gains to be made with in-season developments that could well change the course of the championship. Haas started strong this season with promising performances competing with the likes of Mercedes, but whilst the other teams have all bought significant upgrade packages, it's Haas that have been left behind. So what's happened to the Haas upgrades? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The upgrade situation. The British Grand Prix saw a huge wave of developments, particularly for the big teams of the sport. These teams bought new engine covers, new floors and new diffusers. Even Williams bought a huge upgrade package changing 12 elements of Albon's 2022 Challenger. Meanwhile, the single Haas upgrade was to their front wing end plate, a small element that won't really have the potential to propel the team up the order. There was a similar story at the Spanish Grand Prix earlier this season. McLaren on this occasion bought 10 upgrades, with Haas being the only team on that occasion to not bring any upgrades for that race weekend. In fact, with the new so-called show and tell rules of 2022, the teams have had to declare where their cars differ from race to race. Of course, many of these upgrades are for performance, but there are also others which are either reliability related or track specific modifications. But with the upgrades declared, I went back through and totaled the number of upgrades or changes per team. Of course, this isn't an exact science, so there will be different interpretations of these figures regarding the number of upgrades the teams have declared. I think it's also really important to recognise that the number of developments or upgrades does not necessarily perfectly correlate with the money spent on development, as this will vary depending on the parts themselves and the approaches taken by the teams. For example, there are often small tweaks to a front wing when a new rear wing is bought, which isn't a major upgrade but would still need to be declared in the same way, and will probably cost less to produce. But, based on the numbers I've collected, the 9 teams, not including Haas, have averaged 17.9 upgrades over the season so far, with Williams bringing the most with 26 total changes after the 12 that they bought to Silverstone. Haas, on the other hand, have bought just 5 upgrades in total so far in 2022, one of those being that small front wing end plate modifications and others being specific track upgrades, like a lower profile wing for Miami for example. When you consider just how important upgrades are in 2022, it shows the magnitude of problems that Haas are experiencing. The team with the next fewest upgrades is AlphaTauri, with just 10 improvements to their car. And again, when you consider that many of these are circuit-specific tweaks that will have been in the pipeline well before the season even began, I think it's safe to assume that not many of the Haas upgrades can really be considered performance-related, with the team improving based on the data gathered so far this year. So we've seen that while many other teams are bringing huge upgrades to their cars, Haas are being left behind. In June, it was revealed that the Haas team anticipate that their major upgrade that was originally planned for France has been pushed back to Hungary. It was also revealed that this single upgrade package will be the only one and only change that the team plan to bring this season. An interesting approach and perhaps a sign of the fact that this is a team that did indeed lose its title sponsor earlier this year. So why has this happened to Haas? Well, before we take a look at that, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. We're in the final month before the summer break, which is when I'm aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers. If you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe button to help me get there. Thanks. A turbulent season so far. Even before the season began, it was a tough time for the Haas team. They broke ties with their title sponsor, meaning they had lost one of their key sources of funding. On the other hand, it did give them the opportunity to upgrade their driver lineup, replacing Nikita Mazepin with the experienced driver of Kevin Magnussen. Haas proved that forgetting about the 2021 season entirely to focus on these new regulations was worth it based on their early season form. Kevin Magnussen managed to score 15 points with a best result of 5th at the opening round in Bahrain. In the first few races, Magnussen scored 3 point scoring finishes over 4 rounds, but since then, Haas have dropped backwards. At the start of the year, a good race meant that they would be able to get into the points, but now a good race is looking more like 13th or 14th place. Early on it was Magnussen that capitalised, but since then Mick Schumacher has looked slightly more consistent. And then, the team have needed chaotic races with lots of retirements, such as the one last weekend at Silverstone, to take advantage and score some more opportunistic points. And fortunately for the team, they now have a driver lineup that can do exactly that. But this season has also had 2 very significant crashes for Mick Schumacher. with the German driver suffering a 33G shunt in Jeddah, splitting his car in half in qualifying. Then again in Monaco, an incident which was a relatively small error got punished, as small mistakes tend to be in Monaco. Again in this crash, Schumacher's Haas car split into two pieces in another costly incident for the team and for the driver. It was reported that Schumacher's Jeddah crash would have cost the team up to $1 million in repairs, and presumably the incident in Monaco will have cost the team a similar amount. But it isn't just the financial impact of these incidents that may have caused issues for the team. As well as costing the team money to replace the damaged car parts, the team will have also lost valuable time. I wouldn't be surprised if the upgrade plans that were scheduled for France were originally planned to be delivered even sooner. The team's limited personnel may have been forced to reproduce more of the current parts for the team as opposed to focusing on their development efforts, something that the larger teams may not be as vulnerable to in 2022. Haas's further announcement that they were not to be proceeding with any more upgrades in 2022 after this first one is an interesting development. There are certainly some points to infer from this. The first is that the team is clearly struggling compared to the others from a financial perspective. They're already preferring the idea of developing for next year rather than this one, despite the promising start that they had. This perhaps adds weight to a rumour that was circulating throughout 2021, with the team potentially being up for sale. If they were to be sold, they want to create the idea that next year could be better than this one, which then raises the potential value of the team. Although, considering there isn't a change in the regulations, this is perhaps less of an upside for a potential buyer. Having said this, the team have consistently said that they aren't for sale, and nothing has been said to imply that this could have changed. Overall though, in a season where Haas have been dropping back from the front, to know that there's just a single update coming to support the team, I can't imagine the two drivers are best pleased with the situation. But perhaps continued development isn't any better. One of the things that Haas have said they focused on in 2022 is their setups. This is something that can be beneficial this season as the teams gathered more and more data on their cars. But as much as they may have worked up to Spain, where Haas performed well in qualifying despite not bringing upgrades, since then the rest of the teams on the grid have had time to learn about their upgrades and how best to set them up on their cars, and it's Haas that have found it more difficult to keep up with their rivals. And at the British Grand Prix, their performance in qualifying was one of their worst yet, as they struggled in the wet conditions and both drivers exited in Q1. Their double points finish in the race though built on a brilliant qualifying for the team in Canada, where they qualified 5th and 6th in the wet conditions, but on that occasion the drivers fell back down the order, with Schumacher retiring due to an engine failure and Magnussen losing out on his points due to a battle with Hamilton at the start of the race, meaning he suffered damage and dropped back. It was a good opportunity gone begging for the team, but there are still some signs that if things go to plan, the team can be competitive. Meanwhile, there are also some teams that have been commenting that they're struggling with inflation and may struggle to see out the rest of the season if they don't get more budget. Well, I think Haas have found the perfect solution to that with their zero upgrade solution. Sure, they have had some significant crash damages to cover, but even on a smaller budget, they're not complaining about inflation or budget constraints in 2022. The truth is that Haas are looking likely to finish either 8th or 9th in the Constructors' Championship this year, despite all the promising signs of them putting all of their development efforts into this 2022 car throughout last season. For me, 8th or 9th can only be described as a failure for this team. Yes, they probably have the lowest budget of all the constructors, but they showed so much promise from the start of the year in Bahrain, and arguably a key reason for the team's delayed development could be Schumacher's 2 large crashes, which perhaps set them back early on. There is of course plenty of potential for the team to take a big step forward with their upgrades later this year, and hopefully this brings them back in line with the other teams more often. Similarly, as we saw at Silverstone, the team can pull some brilliant performances out when they get the opportunity with a race of attrition. They managed to score another 5 points over the British Grand Prix weekend, but you have to question whether they'll be able to maintain that, given on pace the Haas cars look to be much further back. A resurgence for the team feels unlikely considering how long it's taken some of the other teams to get on top of their upgrades and bring further developments to get the most from them. And I think it's fair to assume that Haas will have a learning curve to overcome as well. This year's regulations are particularly challenging and complex. The new ground effect based cars are very clearly sensitive to upgrades, particularly with the floor. Some of the more experienced teams, like Mercedes, have bought 24 upgrades so far in 2022, and many of them have been related to the floor, and it's taken them a long time to get on top of these upgrades and getting them to work. Personally, I think Haas may struggle to compete for the rest of this year. If Williams' new upgrades from Silverstone work, then there's every chance that they could get themselves back in the contention with the Haas and Aston Martin teams, although the early season form from the American team could just keep themselves in front. What we know for sure is that the competition between the bottom 3 teams is definitely still an important one to watch as they battle it out in the development race. And if you want to learn more about the budget cap in 2022 and how it's creating difficulties for some teams to make the developments that they want to, make sure you watch this video next.